It was supposed to be just another quiet evening at Bella's, a cozy little restaurant tucked away on the corner of Main Street. The place was warm, inviting, and filled with the soft hum of laughter and clinking glasses. Families enjoyed their dinners, couples shared quiet conversations, and the staff moved gracefully between tables. No one expected anything unusual to happen that night. But everything changed when three men walked through the door. They didn't look like trouble at first glance, dressed casually, joking with each other as they entered. But there was something about their eyes. Sharp, restless, searching for something, or someone. They took a table near the center of the room, their voices louder than necessary, drawing glances from other diners. First, people ignored them. After all, restaurants get their fair share of rowdy customers. But as the minutes passed, their behavior became impossible to overlook. Across the room, a woman sat alone at a small table by the window. She had just ordered her meal and was scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered by the world around her. She looked like any other diner, mid-30s, simple jeans and a black leather jacket, hair tied back neatly. Nothing about her suggested she was someone to notice. But for some reason, the three men seemed to take an interest in her. They started whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward her repeatedly. One of them smirked. Another leaned back in his chair and said something under his breath that made the others laugh. Then, without warning, they stood up. The restaurant seemed to freeze for a moment as they began walking toward her table. Some diners glanced nervously but quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. The woman didn't notice them at first, or maybe she did and simply chose not to react. She continued scrolling on her phone as the three men approached, their steps deliberate, their intentions unclear but unmistakably unpleasant. By the time they reached her table, the air in the room was heavy with tension. Conversations had stopped. Even the waiters hesitated in their tracks. One of the men leaned over her table and said something too low for anyone else to hear. Whatever it was, it made his friends chuckle. Still, the woman didn't look up. She calmly set her phone down, took a sip of water, and finally raised her eyes to meet theirs. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, steady focus that made the tallest of the three hesitate for half a second. That's when everything changed. 15 seconds later, the entire restaurant would be on its feet, stunned by what they had just witnessed. And those three men. They were about to learn a lesson they would never forget, because the woman they chose to mess with wasn't just any woman. She was a Navy veteran, and she was about to remind them why that mattered. The silence that followed her words was thick, almost suffocating. The three men exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Something in her tone, calm and unshaken, made them hesitate, but pride is a dangerous thing, and none of them wanted to back down in front of a room full of strangers. She slowly stood up from her chair, her movements controlled, deliberate. Not a single sound from her as she pushed the chair back and faced them fully. She wasn't tall, and she didn't look particularly strong, but there was a presence about her, a kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively step aside. The other diners felt it too. They didn't know who she was, but suddenly, all eyes in the restaurant were locked on her. "Look," one of the men said, trying to laugh it off. "We're just having a little fun. No need to get serious." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his confidence. His friend, the one who had leaned in earlier, wasn't so quick to retreat. He crossed his arms and gave her a mocking smile. "You think you're tough?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes flickered briefly to the exit, then back to them. It wasn't fear, they realized that too late. It was calculation. She was assessing, thinking, planning. In the far corner of the restaurant, a middle-aged man wearing a chef's apron had stepped out from the kitchen, his brow furrowed. He'd seen this sort of thing before. Guys looking for trouble. But something about this woman gave him pause. He didn't move closer. He just watched. The woman finally spoke, her voice low but clear enough for the entire room to hear. "You've got one chance to walk away. I'd take it if I were you." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. They rippled through the restaurant, leaving an uneasy quiet in their wake. The tallest man laughed nervously, as though trying to brush off the growing tension. "And if we don't," he said. For the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. It wasn't warm. It wasn't reassuring. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill crawling down your spine, the kind that came from someone who'd seen things you couldn't imagine. "You'll find out," she replied. What no one in that room knew was that this woman had spent over a decade in the Navy. She'd served in places most people couldn't locate on a map, endured training that broke stronger men, and learned to keep her composure when chaos erupted. She didn't flaunt it, didn't carry herself like someone desperate to prove a point, but when trouble found her, instincts took over. And right now, every instinct told her these men weren't just here to talk. A fork clattered to the floor somewhere in the back, startling a few patrons. The sound seemed to snap the moment in half. One of the men stepped closer, his face hardening. That's when her hand twitched ever so slightly, barely noticeable to most. But for those who were paying attention, it was the calm before the storm. Something was about to happen, and when it did, this quiet little restaurant would never be the same again. The man who had stepped closer was now only a foot away from her. His jaw was tight, and his shoulders squared as if he wanted to show he wasn't intimidated. But there was something in his eyes, something uncertain, like a man who had just realized he'd walked into deeper water than he expected. The woman didn't move back. She stood her ground, her gaze steady, unflinching. To anyone watching, she seemed almost too calm, like she was waiting for something. The air inside Bella's felt heavier with every passing second, the kind of pressure that builds before a thunderstorm. At another table near the door, a young couple exchanged nervous glances. The man reached for his phone under the table, his fingers trembling slightly as he unlocked the screen. He hesitated, should he call the police? But what would he even say? That 3 men were standing over a woman who hadn't even raised her voice. Still, something about the scene told him this wasn't going to end quietly. Behind the counter, the waitress gripped a coffee pot so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had been serving tables here for 3 years and had seen arguments, the occasional drunk customer, but nothing like this. She thought about stepping in, about saying something, but one look at the woman's face told her not to. Whatever was about to happen, this woman didn't need saving. The man in front of her leaned in closer, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're better than us? Sitting here like you own the place?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I think you've already made your mistake," she said softly. The words seemed to hit harder than any shout could have. His friend, the one standing behind him, shifted uneasily. "Maybe we should just leave," he muttered, but the leader ignored him, too stubborn to back down in front of an audience. What none of them noticed was how she had subtly positioned herself. Her chair was no longer behind her. The table was to her left, angled just enough to give her room to move. It was a habit she didn't even think about anymore. Always knowing her surroundings, always ready. In the back of the restaurant, the chef slipped into the kitchen and reached for the phone. He knew trouble when he saw it, and something told him this was about to get out of hand fast. But just as he dialed, a loud crash erupted from the dining room. One of the men had slammed his hand down on her table, knocking over her water glass. The liquid spilled across the floor, splashing against her boots. She looked down at it briefly, then back up at him. And then, for the first time, she moved. It wasn't much, just a single step forward, but it was enough to make the man instinctively step back. The entire room went silent again. Nobody knew what she was about to do next. Nobody even dared to breathe too loudly. Whatever was coming, everyone in that restaurant could feel it. The storm was no longer just approaching. It was here. Her single step forward seemed to change everything. The leader froze for a moment, caught off guard by how deliberate and controlled the movement was. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was a warning. And warnings from people like her were never empty. The man behind him glanced toward the door again, clearly wanting out. "Let's just go," he whispered, but his voice barely carried over the tense silence. The leader's pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He straightened up, puffing out his chest like someone trying to convince themselves they still held the upper hand. "You don't scare me," he muttered, though it sounded more like an attempt to convince himself than her. She didn't reply. Instead, she glanced at the room around her. Every face was locked on them. Parents shielding their kids' eyes, a man in the corner clutching his phone, the waitress biting her lip so hard it looked painful. The woman's gaze settled briefly on the young couple near the door. She noticed the man's trembling hands still gripping his phone. She gave the faintest nod, permission. He understood. His thumb pressed the call button. The leader didn't notice any of it. He was too focused on her, too consumed by his need to assert dominance. "You think you're some kind of hero," he sneered. "You don't even know who you're dealing with." She finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "Neither do you." The words landed like a hammer. Her tone wasn't defiant. It was factual, chillingly so. She had spent years in situations where hesitation could cost lives. She had read people, studied them, understood how they moved, how they thought. And right now, she knew exactly what this man was about to do, before even he did. He lunged forward, his hand shooting out toward her arm. But she was already moving. The room gasped as her body shifted fluidly to the side. His grasp cutting through empty air. It was like watching a dancer in perfect rhythm, each motion precise and effortless. Before he could react, she had stepped inside his reach, her presence suddenly overwhelming, a wall of calm power. The other two men tensed, unsure whether to jump in or step back. Their instincts screamed retreat, but loyalty to their leader held them frozen in place. Around them, the diners shrank into their seats, hearts pounding. "Stop," the second man finally said, his voice breaking. "This isn't worth it." The leader ignored him, trying to twist free of her control, but she hadn't even touched him yet. That was the most unnerving part. She didn't need to. Her mere stance had taken the fight out of him. Then in one swift motion she moved again, so fast the eye could barely follow. Chairs scraped, a glass shattered on the floor, and the sound of someone shouting, "Police are on their way," rang through the room. Everything was happening at once now. Panic, movement, the crescendo of a moment that had been building from the second those men walked in. And at the center of it all stood the woman, unflinching, ready for whatever came next. The next few seconds would decide everything. The sound of "police are on their way" seemed to break the thin thread holding the room together. The two men who had hung back shifted nervously, glancing toward the door as if debating whether to make a run for it. But before they could move, the leader let out a sharp whistle, one that didn't make sense until the restaurant door swung open again. Fourth man stepped inside. He wasn't like the others. Taller, broader, dressed in a dark jacket zipped up to his neck. His expression was flat, unreadable, and his eyes immediately locked onto the woman at the center of the room. The tension that had already been suffocating seemed to double instantly. This wasn't some random bystander. This was backup. The diners felt it too. A child whimpered quietly, his mother pulling him close. The waitress ducked behind the counter, whispering frantically to the chef in the back. The young man near the door still had his phone pressed to his ear, murmuring to the dispatcher, "Send them fast, please, something's about to happen." The woman's stance didn't change. But inside, her pulse quickened. This wasn't just a barroom ego trip anymore. This was coordinated. She scanned the newcomer, noting his posture, his gloves, the faint bulge at his waistband that didn't look like a phone. Her mind ran through options quickly, discarding most. The odds had just shifted, and not in her favor. The leader's confidence returned the moment his friend entered. "You really should have kept quiet," he said, his smirk back in place. "Now it's not just you and me." For the first time, the woman moved her gaze away from them, to the exit, then to the ceiling where a small black dome camera blinked. She didn't know if anyone was watching on the other end, but she needed them to. She took one deliberate step toward the center of the room, her voice carrying clearly. "You want to do this here?" she asked. In front of all these people. The new man's lips curved into the faintest smile. We don't care who's watching. The words sent a ripple of fear through the diners. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was something bigger, something planned. Why here? Why her? She didn't have time to wonder. The fourth man moved suddenly, stepping between tables, his pace quickening. The leader followed, circling slightly to cut off her escape route. They were boxing her in, and the entire room knew it. In the kitchen, the chef was whispering urgently into the phone. They're surrounding her. I don't know how long she can hold them off. The woman's eyes narrowed. She had been in worse spots before, but never with this many innocent people in the crossfire. Her training screamed at her to act before they did. And then, as if to confirm her instincts, the lights in the restaurant flickered once, then went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. Gasps and cries filled the air. Chairs scraped, someone dropped a plate, and in the blackness, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, fast, deliberate, moved toward her. The real fight had just begun. The darkness was absolute, but she didn't panic. Her breathing stayed steady, every muscle poised. Years of training had taught her that darkness could be an advantage, if you knew how to use it. She closed her eyes briefly, letting her ears take over. There a footstep to her left, light hesitant, another heavier directly ahead closing in fast. She moved before they did. Sliding one step sideways, she grabbed the edge of a chair and kicked it hard in the direction of the sound. It crashed into someone's legs, followed by a startled grunt and a heavy fall. One down. The room erupted in chaos. Diners screamed, some dove under tables. The fourth man cursed in the darkness, his voice close now. She pivoted just as a hand reached for her shoulder. She caught the wrist mid-air, twisted sharply, and slammed the attacker against a table. Wood splintered. He went silent. Then a beam of light cut through the dark, the door bursting open, a police officer's flashlight slicing across the room. Police. Hands where we can see them. The lights flickered back on. What the officers walked into was chaos. Two of the original three men were on the floor, groaning. The leader stood frozen a few feet from her, chest heaving, face pale. The fourth man was pinned against a table by her grip. His jacket pulled back just enough to reveal what she had suspected, a concealed weapon. The officer barked another command, and this time no one argued. The men were cuffed quickly, dragged toward the waiting patrol cars outside. As the room slowly calmed, diners began to stand, still shaken. The waitress emerged from behind the counter, tears in her eyes. Are you okay?" she asked the woman. She released the last man into the officer's custody and straightened her jacket. "I'm fine," she said simply. The leader, now being shoved out the door, glared at her. "You don't know who you just messed with," he spat. She met his gaze, unblinking. "Actually," she replied quietly, "I know exactly who you are." The words made him falter for just a moment before the door closed behind him. The officer who seemed to be in charge turned to her. "Ma'am, we're going to need a statement. Do you know these men?" She paused, considering her answer. "Not personally," she said finally. "But I've been expecting them." The officer frowned. Expecting them. She didn't elaborate. Instead, she glanced at the black dome camera in the corner again. Somewhere someone would be watching the footage. Someone who had sent those men. And they would know she had survived. She picked up her phone from the table, checked the screen, and slipped it into her pocket. "You'll have my statement," she told the officer, already heading for the door. Outside, the night air was cool, calm, almost peaceful. But she knew this wasn't over. Tonight had only been a message. And whoever was behind it had just made a very big mistake. She walked down the quiet street, the glow of the restaurant fading behind her. The night was still, but her mind wasn't. Every detail of what had just happened replayed in her head. The way they had entered, the way they moved, the timing of that fourth man. It hadn't been random. They had been testing her. A patrol car pulled up beside her. The officer from earlier stepped out. "Ma'am," he said gently, "are you sure you're all right? We can arrange protection if you need it." She gave a small, tired smile. "I appreciate it, but I'll be fine." He hesitated. "Those men. Do you know why they were after you?" She looked at him for a moment, then shook her head slightly. "Some things are better left off the record," she replied. "But thank you for coming when you did." He nodded, still puzzled, but didn't press further. As the car drove away, she stood for a moment under the streetlight, taking a deep breath. The world outside looked so normal. Cars parked along the curb, a soft breeze rustling the leaves, the distant sound of laughter from somewhere down the block. And yet, she knew nothing was truly normal anymore. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a single text message from an unknown number. "We'll be in touch." She stared at it for a long moment before slipping the phone back into her jacket. No reply. Not yet. She wasn't running from this, she never had. She had left the Navy years ago, but some battles follow you long after you think you've walked away. Tonight had only confirmed that. As she headed toward her apartment, she thought of the people inside the restaurant. The terrified waitress, the young man who had called for help, the family huddled in the corner. They hadn't asked to be part of this, but they'd witnessed what happened when someone stands their ground. Maybe she hoped they would take something from that. Courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about refusing to be afraid. Inside her building, she paused by the window of her small living room, looking out at the city lights. She had spent years protecting others in places far from home. Maybe it was time to do the same here. Not as a soldier, but as someone who understood what danger looked like and how to stop it. She locked her door, sat on the edge of her bed, and allowed herself one final thought before sleep claimed her. They think I'm the target. They're wrong. I'm the problem they can't solve. And with that, she closed her eyes, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Far away, in a dimly lit room, a man watched the restaurant footage on a screen. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile on his lips. "She's better than we thought," he murmured. Then, almost to himself, he added, "Good. Let's see how good she really is." The game had just begun. But tonight at least she had won.